Good evening, everyone. Welcome in to the very first episode, hopefully the first of many, of Reconquering History. We're doing this live on Twitch to be uploaded on YouTube, so if you are watching this on YouTube, you can feel free to join us at Twitch TV/Author Valentine. We'll be doing this live on Wednesday nights for now, between 6 and 8 p.m. roughly, Japan time, because that is where I live. So you can communicate, talk to each other, talk to me live while we're doing these discussions. If you are on YouTube, make sure to give the video a like and a subscribe. And if you're on Twitch, make sure to say hello in chat. Thank you everyone for coming to this. I do appreciate it. We're going to be covering a lot in this series, especially concerning Julius Caesar, his rise, and then the conquest of the Gallic territories from the Celts. And how are we going to be doing this? Well, primarily, we're going to be looking at several sources. In this case, there's going to be Plutarch, Suetonius, and then, of course, how could we forget, Julius Caesar's memoirs, particularly the Gallic War. If there's enough traction, we can also move on to the Civil War and talk about that. And the idea is that while we're reading these texts, that we can add context to make them more understandable. And in doing so, we can reject and refute some of the modern takes, I guess we could say, of the historical community, the Roman appreciators, certain YouTubers who have drawn, I believe you could call, incorrect conclusions or even outright lies from certain events, certain actions, and certain people from this era. If you had to put a face on the name of Rome, if you had to think of a person that best represented the nation and empire of Rome at any point in time, from the monarchy to the republic to the empire, the principate, the dominant, the Eastern Romans, who would it be? Now, some of you, depending on where you're familiar with history, might have thought of Romulus, of course, the first king, who slew his brother Remus and founded the city of Rome. Some people might naturally gravitate towards Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, the last of the 5 good emperors, who penned his thoughts in the Meditations and contributed perhaps the most important Stoic text of all time that people still read to this day very actively. You might think of Cicero, the famous orator and lawmaker who was a contemporary of Julius Caesar, or perhaps, if you're a devout Christian, you might even think of Constantine the Great, who brought Christianity out of its state of oppression in the empire into the limelight and changed the primary religion of an entire empire. But I'm willing to bet that most people, when asked that question of the face they would put to the empire, would think of Julius Caesar. And I am one of those people. In my opinion, Julius Caesar is the greatest leader of men to have ever lived in any nation at any time. No one sacrificed more for his men, his people, and his country than Julius Caesar. No one was as decisive. No one put as much thought into what they were doing and where they were going at all times. Julius Caesar is the epitome of Roman virtue. He doesn't falter. He doesn't waver. And he seeks at all times not to glorify himself, but to serve the Senate and people of Rome. To start, today we're going to be working on the lead-up to the Gallic War. And by that, I mean we're going to be focusing on the earlier days of Julius Caesar, so we can understand who the man was and what he had accomplished before the campaign that would define his rule and his place in history. Now, to do this, as I said earlier, we're going to be looking primarily at two sources, that being of the famous historian Plutarch and of Suetonius. We're going to be looking more at Plutarch. Suetonius tends to dive quite deeply into rumors, and he often will start a paragraph with "it is said," or "it is supposed," or "it is believed." He talks about the haruspices, the things that happened that prophesized the coming of Caesar or the rise of Augustus. And while all this is very interesting, I find Plutarch to be a little bit more rounded and relevant to our discussion here. I'm going to read to you the very beginning of Plutarch's account on Caesar. This comes from the text The Fall of the Roman Republic. I have the Penguin Classics version here. If you're interested in reading along, or if you're wanting to read up on Roman history, this is an excellent text. Of course, it doesn't just cover Caesar, it also covers Pompey and Marius and Sulla and Cicero, the major important figures of the time. So let's read here just about the very beginning. Where does it start? Plutarch says, "After Sulla had seized power, he wanted to make Caesar divorce his wife Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, who had previously held the entire government in his hands. But he could not persuade Caesar to do this either by promises or by intimidation. So he confiscated her dowry. The reason for Caesar's hatred of Sulla was his relationship to Marius. Julia, a sister of Caesar's father, was the wife of the elder Marius and the mother of Marius the younger, who was therefore Caesar's cousin. At the beginning, when so many people were being killed, and there was so much to do, Caesar was overlooked by Sulla. But instead of being content with this, he presented himself to the people as a candidate for a priesthood, though he was still only a mere boy. Sulla, without openly objecting, took measures to see that he was not elected and discussed the question of whether or not to have him put to death. when some of his advisors said that there was no point in killing a boy like him, Sulla replied that they must be lacking in intelligence if they did not see that in this boy there were many Mariuses. Well, what does that mean? Let's zoom out for a moment and talk about this time period. Caesar was born in the year 100 BC, in July. And this was just after the end of the Cimbrian War, which was an invasion of Germans and Gauls to both northern Italy, to Gaul, and of Hispania, during which a man named Gaius Marius proved himself an outstanding general and statesman. Now, Julius Caesar's aunt, Julia, was Gaius Marius's wife. So he was Caesar's uncle by marriage. But Marius ended up embroiled in a civil war against a man named Sulla. And both of them were on separate ends of their factions. Sulla was the leader of the Optimatus, the aristocracy. In chat, we like to call them Big Olive, because that's who they represent. And Marius was on the side of the popularis, the people. So there was a civil war, and Marius was defeated, as well as his ally Cinna. And when Sulla came back to Rome, he had himself declared dictator. Now, for context, dictator in the Roman state was an actual position. A consul could be elevated to the position of dictator in times of crisis. Some people will call Caesar the dictator of Rome, and that is because eventually Caesar too will be elevated to this position. And when Sulla was elevated, he did something that would be sadly repeated about 70 years later by Caesar's heir, Augustus. And he wrote what were called the prescriptions. And he wasn't prescribing medicine. No, this is proscriptions. Essentially, he would create a name or a list of names and post them on the door of the Senate. And those were people who were to be put to death. And there would be rewards for whoever could bring them in or bring in their heads. This was an awful practice. It turned Roman against Roman. It turned family member against family member. Brother might kill brother just to collect his bounty, and so he might clear his own name. And because Caesar was a relation of Marius, Sulla seriously considered having Caesar prescripted. Plutarch says, "This remark was reported to Caesar, and for some time he went into hiding, wandering from place to place in the Sabine country. In the end, he became ill, and while he was going from one house to another at night, he fell into the hands of some of Sulla's soldiers, who were searching the district and arresting those who were in hiding there. With a bribe of 2 talents, Caesar persuaded their leader, Cornelius, to let him go, and then went immediately to the sea and sailed to King Nicomedes in Bithynia." So Caesar is a teenager, by the way, at this point. He's probably 16 or 17. and he's having to spend this time in hiding from the state. He is in fear for his life, and he is eventually captured, but manages to get out of it by just having enough money to help at the time. We'll switch over to Suetonius to talk a little bit more about Caesar's time in Asia. Suetonius says, Caesar first saw military service in Asia, where he went as an aide-de-camp to Marcus Thermus, the Praetorian governor of the province. When Thermus sent Caesar to raise a fleet in Bithynia, he wasted so much time at King Nicomedes' court that a homosexual relationship was suspected, and suspicion gave place to scandal when soon after his return to headquarters he revisited Bithynia, ostensibly collecting a debt incurred there by one of his freedmen. However, Caesar's reputation improved later in the campaign, when Thermus awarded him the civic crown at the storming of Mytilene. I find it very interesting and slightly amusing that even 2,000 years ago, the best slander that you could serve to someone was by calling them a butt pirate and suspecting them of homosexuality to clearly ruin their political career. That is neither here nor there. But it is a slander that would be levied against Caesar several times by his naysayers. And this is where Caesar first distinguishes himself. In service to Thermus, very well, as a soldier, and he was awarded, as Suetonius says, the civic crown, which was the second highest honor of the Roman state, given, I believe, for saving the life of another citizen. So he distinguished himself as a soldier in the military. Suetonius continues. He says, Caesar also campaigned in Cilicia under Servilius Isauricus, but not for long, because the news of Sulla's death sent him hurrying back to Rome, where a revolt headed by Marcus Lepidus seemed to offer prospects of rapid advancement. Now, from here, Suetonius gets into this story about a supposed connection Caesar had with this Lepidus. So we're going to skip that part because this is, like I said earlier, one of Suetonius's many rumor barges. But then we get to an interesting event. Now, Plutarch and Suetonius describe this slightly differently, and by slightly differently, I mean they occur at different times. And this is the famous kidnapping of Julius Caesar by Cilician pirates. Nevectus in the chat asks, had Caesar had military training formally? Neither of them say he was trained while he was in Rome. However, I can assume when he went to Asia, he would have been trained very quickly. Excuse me while I take a sip of water there. So let's talk about pirates. And let's talk about Caesar's abduction and capture and how it happened. We'll go back to Plutarch. He stayed for a short time with the king, and then on his voyage back was captured near the island of Pharmacusa by some of the pirates who even at that time controlled the seas with their large fleets of ships and innumerable smaller craft. First, when the pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents, Caesar burst out laughing. They did not know, he said, who it was that they had captured, and he volunteered to pay 50. Then, when he had sent his followers to the various cities in order to raise the money, and was left with one friend and 2 servants among these Cilicians, about the most bloodthirsty people in the world, he treated them so high-handedly that, whenever he wanted to sleep, he would send to them and tell them to stop talking. For 38 days, with the greatest unconcern, he joined in all their games and exercises, just as if he was their leader instead of their prisoner. He also wrote poems and speeches which he read aloud to them. And if they failed to admire his work, he would call them to their faces illiterate savages, and would often laughingly threaten to have them all hanged. They were much taken with this, and attributed his freedom of speech to a kind of simplicity in his character, or boyish playfulness. However, the ransom arrived from Miletus, and as soon as he had paid it and been set free, he immediately manned some ships, and set sail from the harbor of Miletus against the pirates. He found them still there, lying at anchor off the island, and he captured nearly all of them. He took their property as spoils of war, and put the men themselves into the prison at Pergamum. He then went in person to Junius, the governor of Asia, thinking it proper that he, as praetor in charge of the province, should see to the punishment of the prisoners. Junius, however, cast longing eyes at the money, which came to a considerable sum, and kept saying that he needed time to look into the case. Caesar paid no further attention to him. He went to Pergamum, took the pirates out of prison, and crucified the lot of them, just as he had often told them he would do when he was on the island and they imagined that he was just joking. And what do we make of this? This is Caesar, remember, still a young man. And he seems completely unconcerned for his own safety. And not only that, he seems to almost laugh at the danger. They kidnapped the wrong man. That's correct. Perhaps this seems strange to you, but we also have to remember how Caesar spent much of his formative years, like Plutarch and Suetonius have said, in hiding. Sulla was a real threat to him. Death was always close. But these pirates cared for nothing but gold. And so perhaps he knew that he had seen much worse than these pirates, and he knew exactly what they wanted. Again, piracy at this time was quite rampant. So the capture of nobles or aristocrats was probably one of the most profitable things that could happen to a pirate, and if they could exchange the safe return of said nobleman for a hefty amount of gold, well then why not? And knowing this, Caesar probably said, well, if I'm dead, I'm worth nothing. So what do I have to be afraid of? And now, Caesar makes his return to Rome. Behind the scenes, Caesar's mother is still in Rome. His father had already passed. His father had died when Caesar was 15. And apparently, with some maneuvering from Caesar's mother, as well as some of the Vestal virgins, they were able to convince Sulla to allow Caesar to return to Rome. Now remember, Caesar had been completely disenfranchised by Sulla. Plutarch mentions that he lost his dowry, but that's not all that he lost. He also lost his inheritance from his father, and he was deprived of his property. So Caesar was not only shooed away in fear of his life, but he had essentially been stripped of almost everything he had. And when he returns to Rome, he does not decide to live a quiet life. So we'll read a little bit about what Caesar did from Plutarch on his return. He gets into law. And what does he do? Let's read. Plutarch says, after he had returned to Rome, he prosecuted Dolabella for the maladministration in his province, and many of the Greek cities supplied him with evidence. Dolabella was acquitted, but Caesar, in return for the support which he had received from the Greeks, acted as their advocate when they prosecuted Publius Antonius for corrupt practice before Marcus Lucullus, the praetor of Macedonia. His intervention was so effective that Antonius appealed to the tribunes in Rome, claiming that he was not getting a fair trial in Greece with Greeks as his accusers. In Rome, Caesar won a brilliant reputation and great popularity by his eloquence in these trials. He had an ability to make himself liked, which was remarkable in one of his age. And he was very much in the good graces of the ordinary citizen, because of his easy manners and the friendly way in which he mixed with the people. Then there were his dinner parties and entertainments, and a certain splendor about his whole way of life. All this made him gradually more and more important politically. At first, his enemies thought that this influence of his would soon come to nothing once he stopped spending money, and they stood aside and watched it grow among the common people. Later, however, when it had become too great for anything to be done about it, and was plainly aimed directly at a complete revolution in the state, they realized that it is always wrong to consider that something which begins in a small way cannot rapidly become important if it is left unchecked because of being underrated, and so receives the advantage of continuity. Certainly, Cicero, who is thought to have been the first to have seen beneath the surface of Caesar's political program, and to have feared it as one might fear the smiling surface of the sea, and who understood how powerful a character was hidden behind Caesar's agreeable, good-humored manners, said that, in general, he could detect in everything that Caesar planned or undertook in politics a purpose that was aiming at absolute power. On the other hand, he said, when I notice how carefully arranged his hair is, and when I watch him scratching his head with one finger, I cannot imagine that this man could conceive of such a wicked thing as to destroy the Roman constitution. This, however, belongs at a later date. So again, Caesar returns to Rome. And he starts going after certain people well above his rank. Plutarch mentions Dolabella and Marcus Lucullus. Men, one of them I believe was of consular rank. These are men much older than Caesar, much more seasoned. And he prosecutes them very effectively, to the point where Lucullus seeks help from a tribune in Rome to basically try to get a mistrial declared, because he is so afraid that Caesar's litigation will find him in the slammer, as it were. There are several events which are mentioned here, but I'm going to continue reading from Plutarch. Plutarch says, "The first proof he had of the people's goodwill towards him was when he stood for the post of military tribune at the same time as Gaius Popilius, and came out above him on the list. A second and clearer example of their favor appeared when, after the death of his aunt Julia, the wife of Marius, he made a brilliant public speech in praise of her in the Forum, and was bold enough to display in the funeral procession images of Marius himself. These had not been seen since the time that Sulla came to power. Marius and his friends having been branded as public enemies. On this occasion, there were some who shouted against Caesar for what he had done, but the people shouted them down in no uncertain manner. They welcomed Caesar with loud applause, and showed the greatest admiration for him for having, after such a long time, brought back to Rome, as it were from the dead, the honors due to Marius." Again, as we mentioned at the very beginning, Marius, the wife of Caesar's aunt, the husband of Caesar's aunt Julia. After Sulla had proscripted his allies, of course, he also made sure that nothing of Marius was to be made public. He wasn't to be celebrated, even though he had quite the outstanding record in service to Rome. Gaius Marius is also credited with the creation of the modern, quote-unquote, modern Roman legion. One thing that separated the Roman legion from that Marius created with the one from the past was that it made the generals responsible for their pay, which would come with its own problems that we will see much later. But this is the moment where the legionary of popular imagination comes into one's mind. This is that era. Before this, you have the Hastati and the Princeps and the Triarii, and a different way of fighting, but now it's truly the heavy infantry, the legionaries. That's the era we have entered. So Caesar seems to defy the Sullan faction, Big Olive as they were, by putting displays of his uncle Marius and of others publicly for everyone to see and celebrate. And while certain figures denounce him for this, many are happy and they celebrate it. Because often this is what happens when you censor your political rivals so harshly, so savagely, as it forces them underground, and when finally there's a light, they burst forth again. And the person bringing him that light this time was Caesar, and they flocked to him for this. This again happened at the death of Caesar's aunt. But there was another tragedy that affected Caesar here. So let's continue reading. Plutarch says, "It was an ancient Roman tradition to pronounce public speeches at the funerals of elderly women, but it was not the usual thing in the cases of young women, and Caesar was the first to do it when his own wife died. This also was an action which made him popular. It brought him much sympathy from the people, who regarded him as a tender-hearted man, full of feeling, and liked him for it. After the funeral of his wife, he went out to Spain as quaestor, to one of the praetors called Vetus. He always had the greatest respect for Vetus, and gave his son the appointment of quaestor under him, when he, in his turn, became praetor. When he had completed his service in this post, he married Pompeia as his third wife. By Cornelia, his second, he had a daughter, who was afterwards married to Pompey the Great. Julia, Caesar's daughter, born to him by Cornelia, was the only recognized child of Julius Caesar. And interestingly, while Cornelia was a relative of Cinna, who was the ally and partner of Gaius Marius, who we've talked about several times now, you know who he is, Pompeia was the granddaughter of Sulla himself. The opposite faction. A relative of the dictator Sulla. And he marries her. And he is sent to Spain. Again, as a quaestor. Quaestor is on the lower end of the Roman political spectrum. At the top, of course, you have the consul. And every year, there are 2 consuls who rule. The term is for 1 year. And by this time, the rule was that once you were elected consul and you had finished your term, you could not run again for 10 years. You had to wait, so you couldn't have multiple consulships back to back. It's not like in modern days where you're going to have a president who is elected for 4 years in the case of the United States, or however long it may be in the country that you live. It was a 1-year commitment, and you shared your power. Now, I won't get too far into this, but it will become very relevant to us soon when Caesar himself becomes consul. Under the consuls were the praetors. Under the praetors were the aediles, and finally under them were the quaestors. The quaestors are basically like book boys. Accountants. Simple. Not really a luxurious position, you could say. Consuls and praetors, after they had served in Rome for their year, would be often rewarded with a governorship after their year had finished. So, for example, when Pompey had finished his year as consul, I believe he had Spain given to him as he was becoming what's called a proconsul, or a governor. Caesar, of course, after his consulship, received 3 territories. So he received provinces of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. That, however, we will get to. That's its own little side story. So Caesar suffers the loss of both his aunt and his own wife, back to back. But let's go ahead and keep reading. Plutarch says, Caesar spent money recklessly, and many people thought that he was purchasing a moment's brief fame at an enormous price, whereas in reality he was buying the greatest place in the world at an inconsiderable expense. We are told, for instance, that before entering upon public office, he was 1,300 talents in debt. Then, on being appointed curator of the Appian Way, in addition to the official allowance, he spent vast sums of his own money on it. And when he was aedile, he provided a show of 320 pairs of gladiators fighting in single combat. And what with this, and all his other lavish expenditure on theatrical performances, processions, and public banquets, he threw into the shade all attempts at winning distinction in this way that had been made by previous holders of the office. The result was to make the people so favorably disposed towards him that every man among them was trying to find new offices and new honors to bestow upon him in return for what he had done. This is a very well-known thing that Caesar did. He was not afraid to spend money in service of bettering his position and also trying to garner support for himself. And he's still in a lowly position at this point. He's not yet a consul. He's not the Caesar that you might know. So let's talk more about the parties in Rome. And here I thought you talked about Nero. There were two parties in Rome. One that of Sulla, which since the time had been all-powerful, and the other of Marius, which was then in a very low state indeed, with its numbers all scattered and scarcely daring to show their heads. It was this party which Caesar wished to revive and make his own, and so, during his aedileship, when these great personal displays of his were at their height, he had images of Marius made in secret, and figures of victory, carrying trophies, and brought them to the Capitol by night, and had them set up there. When the sun rose, all these figures could be seen glittering with gold, and constructed with the most exquisite craftsmanship. There were inscriptions, too, commemorating Marius's victories over the Cimbri, and all who saw them were amazed at the daring of the man who had set them up. It was quite obvious who he was. The news soon spread, and brought everyone together to see the sight. There were some who shouted out that this revival of honors, which by laws and decrees were properly dead and done with, was a sign that Caesar himself was aiming at securing supreme power in the state for himself. That, after he had previously softened up the people's feelings, he was now making this experiment to see whether, as a result of his lavish personal displays, they had become sufficiently tame to put up with his humor, and allow him to indulge in these innovations. On the other hand, Marius's party took heart and encouraged each other. It was amazing how many of them there were, who suddenly showed themselves openly, and they filled the Capitol with the noise of their applause. Many burst into tears of joy at the sight of Marius's features. They praised Caesar to the skies and declared him to be, more than anyone, worthy to be Marius's relation. But when the Senate met to discuss the matter, Lutatius Catullus, who at the time was one of the most respected people in Rome, rose up and attacked Caesar. He ended his speech with the memorable words, "You are no longer working underground, Caesar. Your artillery is planted in the open, and it is there for the capture of the state." Caesar, however, defended himself against these charges and convinced the Senate that they were baseless. His admirers then became even more elated, and urged him not to climb down for anybody's sake. The people, they said, would be glad to see him triumph over everyone and be the first man in the state. So now Caesar has taken to the leadership of the party that was almost destroyed by Sulla. And he realizes how many of them there still are. How many people still believed in the cause that Sulla had tried so hard to wipe out. And as he creates these wonderful figures, arts, these busts covered in gold, he makes these and he sets them up in public to display, and the people come out and they realize that they don't have to hide anymore. And it's a wonderful moment for many of them. But it's also a terrifying moment if you're part of Sulla's faction. Because they who have enjoyed a singular power for all this time now realize that there is a challenger in their midst. And this challenger has the support of the people. There's a famous event of Caesar's life where he becomes the Pontifex Maximus, which is what in Rome was essentially the Pope. You could think of it that way. It's the head priest. So let's go ahead and read more. Plutarch says, "It was at this time that Metellus, the chief pontiff, died. This priesthood was very much sought after, and two of the most distinguished men in Rome with the greatest influence in the Senate, Isauricus and Catulus, were candidates for the office. Caesar, however, would not give way to them. He turned to the people and put himself forward as a rival candidate. Since there seemed to be very little in it so far as the feelings of the electors were concerned, Catulus, who with his greater reputation in the first place was most disturbed at the prospect of this uncertainty, sent to Caesar and tried to bribe him with a large sum of money to stand down and abandon this project for putting himself in the public eye. Caesar replied that he would fight the election to the end, even if he had to borrow more money than Catulus had offered him. On the day of the election, Caesar's mother came with him in tears to the door of their house, and Caesar, after kissing her goodbye, said, 'Today, mother, you will see your son either as high priest or as an exile.' The contest was a close one, but when the votes were taken, Caesar came out on top. And this made the Senate and the nobles afraid that he would go on to lead the people forward on a course of violent extremism. And now, I think people might undervalue the importance of this. Because the Pontifex Maximus, I mean, imagine, you haven't served as consul, you haven't been a general. Your power might not be as great or as influential as a higher office in the Senate, but you are the Pontifex Maximus. Religious duties and omens basically start and end with you. And if you're in charge, essentially, of the religion of a nation, that gives you a lot of power. We'll see this come up a little later when it is somewhat challenged by Caesar's future co-consul named Bibulus. Caesar, of course, goes into a bit of debt to accomplish this, but in the end, he is successful. Let's go ahead and continue on. What we'll look at next is probably one of the most famous cases of a conspiracy in Rome, in all of the Roman history, and that is the Catiline conspiracy. So we'll continue reading what Plutarch has to say, and then we'll also look at Suetonius. This was why Piso and Catullus found fault with Cicero for having spared Caesar when, at the time of Catiline's conspiracy, he had given his enemies a hold over him. Catiline had planned not only to overthrow the constitution, but to destroy the whole government and produce a state of complete chaos. He himself had been driven out of the city, this reverse being due to evidence against him of a minor character, before his final plans had come to light. But he left Lentulus and Carthagus behind to organize the conspiracy in his absence. Whether or not Caesar secretly gave these men any help or encouragement, we do not know. But after they had been overwhelmingly proved guilty in front of the Senate, and Cicero, as consul, asked each senator to give his opinion on how they should be punished, all the other senators, until it came to the turn of Caesar, were in favor of the death penalty. But Caesar rose up, and, in a long and carefully worded speech, objected to this. He stated that, in his view, except in the case of the most extreme emergency, it was unprecedented and unjust to put to death without trial men of high rank and of famous families. What he recommended was that they should be put into chains and kept under arrest in whatever cities of Italy Cicero himself might select until the war against Catiline had been won, and that after that, the Senate, in a time of peace and in an atmosphere of calm, should decide what was best to be done in each individual case. Caesar's views seemed so humane in themselves, and the speech with which he backed them was so powerful that not only did he win the support of subsequent speakers in the debate, but many too of those who had spoken before him took back the opinions which they had expressed previously and came over to his side, until it came around to Cato and to Catullus, who vigorously opposed him. Cato's very violent speech helped to fix suspicion on Caesar himself, and the effect of his attack was that the conspirators were handed over to the executioner. And while Caesar was leaving the Senate, many of the young men who at that time were acting as Cicero's bodyguards ran up with drawn swords, ready to make an end of him. However, Curio, so it is said, threw his toga around him and got him away safely. And Cicero himself, when the young men looked at him to see what his wishes were, shook his head, either because he was frightened of the people or because he thought the murder would be entirely unjust and illegal. There are many people who worship, I will use the word worship carefully, but have a kind of hero worship for the character of Cicero in history. And this year that we are talking about, that the Catiline conspiracy occurs, is the year where Cicero is consul, and he is given control. It is in his hands that it is to be decided what to do about the conspirators. And uniquely, perhaps frighteningly, in this situation, Cicero, decides to show up to the Senate with armed bodyguards. Now, remember that the use of arms was forbidden inside the city of Rome. You were not to have a sword. You were not to brandish anything around. It was supposed to be a non-violent city. Supposed to be. Let alone in the Senate itself, where Cicero had come in, and just to get his point across, had men with weapons to intimidate and just get his own way. I do not view Cicero as a terribly heroic person. But that's just my opinion. So Caesar, of course, flees this. Again, just like he was under Sulla, he has reason to be afraid for his life in the city in which he is supposed to be the safest. Let's switch over to Suetonius for a moment. We'll read Suetonius' version of this, which is a little bit shorter. The next danger that threatened Caesar, Suetonius says, was the inclusion of his name in a list of Catilinarian conspirators handed to the special commissioner Novius Niger by an informer named Lucius Vettius, and also in another list laid before the Senate by Quintus Curius, who had been voted a public bounty as the first person to betray the plot. Curius claimed that this information came directly from Catiline, and Vettius went so far as to declare that he could produce a letter written by Catiline, written to Catiline in Caesar's own hand. Caesar would not lie down under this insult, and appealed to Cicero's testimony that he had voluntarily come forward to warn him about the plot, and that Curius was not therefore entitled to the bounty. As for Vettius, who had been obliged to produce a bond when he made his revelation, this was declared forfeit, and his goods were seized. The people, crowding around the rostra, nearly tore him to pieces. Caesar thereupon sent Vettius off to jail, and Novius Niger, the commissioner, as well, for having let a magistrate of a superior rank to himself be indicted in a tribunal. When he talks about the moment in the Senate that we just mentioned under Plutarch, Suetonius says, when the Catilinarian conspiracy came to light, the whole Senate, with the sole exception of Caesar, then praetor elect, demanded the death of those involved. Caesar proposed merely that they should be imprisoned, each in a different town, and their estates confiscated. What was more, he so browbeat those senators who took a sterner line by suggesting that the people would conceive an endearing hatred for them if they persisted in their view, that Decimus Silanus, as consul-elect, felt obliged to interpret his own proposal, which, however, he could not bring himself to recast, in a more liberal sense, begging Caesar not to misread it so savagely. And Caesar would have gained his point, since many senators, including the consul, Cicero's brother, had been won over to his view. Had Marcus Cato not kept the irresolute Senate in line, Caesar continued to block proceedings. Excuse me, I'm hiccuping while I'm reading this. Caesar continued to block proceedings until a body of Roman equites, serving as a defense force, threatened to kill him unless he ceased his violent opposition. They even unsheathed their swords and made such passes at him that most of his companions fled, and the remainder huddled around, protecting him with their arms or their togas. He was sufficiently impressed not only to leave the Senate House, but to keep away from it for the rest of the year. Violence in the Senate again. Now we move from one scandal to another. And this, as Suetonius mentioned, is when Caesar was praetor elect, which means he has just won the election, which is held in the summer, to become praetor, which again is the rank just below consul. and he will be taking it at the very beginning of the next year. So he is a praetor elect. And what happens when Caesar is praetor? Well, let's read. As it happened, there were no disturbances during his praetorship. Plutarch says, there was only a somewhat unfortunate affair which concerned his domestic life. Publius Clodius came from a patrician family and was distinguished both for his wealth and for his powers as an orator. But in his capacity for behaving quite outrageously, he surpassed all the most notorious evil livers of his time. The man was in love with Caesar's wife, Pompeia, who did not reject his advances. However, the women's part of the house was closely supervised by Caesar's mother, Aurelia, and she was a person of strict respectability. She never let the young wife out of her sight, and so made it difficult and dangerous for the lovers to meet. The Romans have a goddess, whom they call the good goddess, the same one as the Greeks, and they call it the women's goddess. The Phrygians claim this goddess as their own, and say that she was the mother of King Midas. The Romans say that she was one of the nymphs called Dryads, and was married to Faunus. The Greeks say that she is that one of the mothers of Dionysus, whose name must not be spoken. And this is why the women, when they are celebrating her festival, cover the tents with branches of vine and, in accordance with the myth, have a sacred snake enthroned at the goddess's side. It is not lawful for a man to be present at these rites, nor even to be in the house where they are being celebrated. The women perform the sacred ceremonies by themselves, and these ceremonies are said to be very much like those of the Orphics. When the time for the festival comes, the consul or praetor at whose house it is being held goes away, as does every male creature in the household. His wife then takes over the house and arranges the decorations. The most important ceremonies take place by night. The women play together among themselves during the night-long celebrations, and there is much music as well. On this occasion, when Pompeia was in charge of the celebrations, Clodius, who was still beardless and therefore thought he would escape notice, dressed himself up as a woman, a female flute player, and, looking just like a young woman, arrived at the house. He found the door open and was brought inside quite safely by the maid on duty, who was in on the secret. The maid then ran off to tell Pompeia. Time passed, and Clodius lacked the patience to stay where he had been left. He began to wander around the house, which was very large, trying to avoid the lights, and was accosted by one of Aurelia's servants, who, as one woman to another, asked him to come and play with her. When Clodius said no, she dragged him forward and asked him who he was and where he came from. Clodius said that he was waiting for Pompeia's girl, Abra, the name of the maid who had been introduced to him. But his voice gave him away. Aurelia's servant shrieked and ran off to where the lights and the crowd were, crying out that she had caught a man. The women were in a panic. Aurelia put a stop to the sacred rites of the goddess and covered up the holy things. She then ordered the doors to be shut and went all over the house with lighted torches in search of Clodius. He was found hiding in the room belonging to the maid who had let him into the house, and, when it was discovered who he was, the women drove him out of doors. They then went away immediately, while it was still night, and told their husbands what had happened. As soon as it was day, then word was going about the city that Clodius had committed sacrilege, and owed satisfaction not only to those who had been outraged by his conduct, but also to the city and to the gods. One of the tribunes, therefore, officially indicted Clodius for sacrilege, and the most influential members of the Senate banded themselves together against him. They gave evidence of a number of shocking crimes which he had committed, among which was adultery with his sister, who was the wife of Lucullus. The people, however, set themselves against this party of the nobility, and their defense of Clodius was very useful to him, so far as the jury were concerned, who took alarm and were terrified of the numbers of his supporters. Caesar divorced Pompeia at once, but when he was called as a witness at the trial, he said he knew nothing about the charges against Clodius. This seemed a most surprising thing to say, and the prosecuting counsel asked, "In that case, why did you divorce your wife?" "Because," Caesar said, "I consider that my wife ought not to even be suspected." Some say that in giving this evidence, Caesar really meant what he said. According to others, he was acting in order to please the people, who were determined to save Clodius. At any rate, Clodius was acquitted of the charge. Most of the jurymen handed in their votes in illegible writing so that they might avoid the risks both of violence from the people if they condemned him and of contempt from the nobility if they acquitted him. What is Caesar playing at here? What is going on? Well, Publius Clodius is, as Plutarch mentions, quite famous, and he is also immensely popular with the people. And this makes Clodius useful. Now, later on, once Caesar has left Rome and he is in Gaul, it is Clodius who will, along with his rival in the conservative or the Sullan party, however you want to call them, Big Olive, we'll just call him that, that's what we like to call him, who will instigate much of the mob violence that will consume the city. And there will be gangs in the streets, fighting each other, killing each other, tearing up the city, making Rome basically like Portland in 2020. You can't trust Big Olive. Caesar divorces his wife. In this moment, did he choose to support Clodius despite this outrage? Because perhaps, having this dirt on Clodius, he knows that Clodius will follow Caesar, and he will be a valuable asset. Because if you're a man who's just been caught dressing up like a woman, invading the house of the praetor, and sleeping with his wife, or attempting to do so, and he's offering you a second chance so you don't get strung up by your heels, chances are you're going to take that forgiveness and you're going to pledge yourself to do whatever the hell he wants you to do. That's just my opinion. Not that I've been ever captured running around a woman's festival dressed as a woman because I'm trying to sleep with someone else's wife, but I imagine that is the general feeling. So Caesar gets himself an ally, in a way, in Clodius. I think it's also interesting that many of the jurors write their verdicts or their votes illegibly because they're so terrified of pissing off either side that they would rather just excuse themselves from their duty. This is the state we find the Republic in. We mentioned before that after a praetor or a consul serves their time, their year in office, they are assigned a province to govern. In this case, Caesar becomes propraetor, or the governor, of Spain. I believe it's Hispania Ulterior, farther Spain. Now, this is where we get the first hints of Caesar's financial troubles. Now, people will harp on this point very frequently, but I believed it was solved sooner than some people would make you believe. Some people use this passage I'm about to read as justification, essentially, for his entire campaign into Gaul. And they say it was because of this passage, he's in debt, he's just paying his debts. And I think that is a bad take. But let's read what Plutarch has to say. Plutarch says, directly after the praetorship, Caesar received Spain as his province. However, he found it very difficult to arrange matters with his creditors, who tried to prevent him from leaving the city and were extremely importunate. He therefore turned for help to Crassus, who was the richest man in Rome, and who needed Caesar's vigor and fire for carrying out his own political campaign against Pompey. Crassus met the demands of those creditors who were most difficult to deal with and would not be put off any longer, and gave his personal guarantee for 830 talents. So Caesar was able to set out for his province. There is a story that while he was crossing the Alps, he came to a small native village with hardly any inhabitants, and altogether a miserable-looking place. His friends were laughing and joking about it, saying, no doubt, here too, one would find people pushing themselves forward to gain office, and here too there are struggles to get the first place and jealous rivalries among the great men. Caesar then said to them in all seriousness, as far as I'm concerned, I would rather be the first man here than the second in Rome. I'm happy that Plutarch starts that with, quote, there is a story. So sometimes you don't know. It's kind of, they almost sound like a fable. But there is that story. People talk about that. What I want to focus on, though, is the previous paragraph we just read about his debts. Remember, Caesar took on an enormous amount of debt so he could win the office of Pontifex Maximus, and also to throw games as aedile. And in order to cover these debts, he allied himself with Crassus. This is the Crassus, Marcus Crassus, who would famously die in Parthia years later, kind of embarrassingly. But this is the Crassus who created Rome's first firefighting squadron. Out of all the slaves he owned, he was a supporter of Sulla, so it's not like he happens to be in the same party as Caesar, but he has his own political agenda that he's tried to push unsuccessfully. And he recognizes that Caesar, despite being in the opposite faction, can help him do this. So he agrees with Caesar to help him cover his debts. Now, we don't know very much about Caesar's time in Spain. Compared to the Gallic War and the governorship he held of Gaul, in which he himself wrote vastly, and other people as well, there is very little we know about what happened during his time as governor of Spain. We'll read what Plutarch has to say, and we'll ruminate on it just a little bit. Plutarch says, certainly, as soon as he reached Spain, he set to work immediately. In a few days, he raised 10 cohorts, in addition to the force of 20 cohorts which was there already. He then marched against the Colaici and the Lusitani, and, after conquering them, went on as far as to the outer sea, subduing the tribes which before then had been independent of Rome. These military successes of his were followed up by equally good work in civilian administration. He established good relations between the various cities. One of his most notable achievements was to solve the problem of the existing ill feeling between debtors and creditors. He ordered that the creditor should take 2/3 annually of the debtor's income, and that the owner of the property should retain the use of the rest of it, and go on in this way until the whole debt was paid off. By these measures he had acquired a great reputation by the time he left his province. He had become rich himself, and he had made his soldiers rich as a result of his campaigns, and he had been saluted by them as imperator. And that is all Plutarch says about this. So there's a few things I want to take away that Plutarch says. First, Caesar raises an army in an unbelievably fast amount of time. Again, he's only in Spain for a single year. And in this single year, not only does he raise an army in addition to the troops he already has, he campaigns against 2 tribes, he wins major victories, and by the spoils of war, he makes himself, and Plutarch says, very rich. Not only himself, but his men. Now, during the Gallic War, one of the criticisms will say that the lesser people levy against Caesar is that he was just in it for the money. He had to pay back the people. But we can see from here that Plutarch seems to suggest that he had made himself already quite the pretty penny in his endeavors in Spain. I'm finding it increasingly unlikely that he needed to go on a 8-year campaign in Gaul, as some of these people say, to satisfy the needs of people to whom he owed money. I think that's silly. I don't know why people cling to this, if I may say, fiction. Complete fiction. Another important thing happens here. As we get closer and closer to Caesar's year as consul, and thereby closer and closer to the outset of the Gallic War. Remember, we haven't even talked about Gaul yet. Caesar's men declare Caesar imperator. They salute him as imperator. And why is this important? Not imperator as an emperor. They're not calling him emperor and that he should take over the state. That's not what it means. Getting saluted by your men as imperator is one of the things that needs to happen in order for a Roman general to celebrate a triumph. There's a couple other things that need to happen, including adding territory to Rome, which of course, after conquering these tribes, Caesar has done. But because of this, Caesar now can have the honor of a Roman triumph. A Roman triumph. This is the perhaps greatest celebration in the Republic. When a successful generalist comes home, remember that usually a general and soldiers are not allowed in the city of Rome. And this is important. Once you are made, in this case, propraetor, like Caesar is, you cannot return to Rome unless you're giving up your command. You cannot cross the city limits or the Pomerium as a soldier. You have to cross as a civilian, a citizen, a private citizen, not as a man with a sword. Now, this is going to be important for what happens next. But this ceremony, the triumph, is when, for the period of celebrations, the army is let in the city for a military parade. Same with the general, of course. They're celebrating him. There's a lot of pomp and circumstance during these, and if they've captured, like for example, an enemy king, or the primary antagonist of the war, that antagonist will be brought up and strangled to death in front of everyone. How lovely. And for those who say how barbaric, but then they tell you that Gallic culture was great and worth preserving, and they just ignore the fact that the Gauls burned innocent people alive as a matter of religion, I tell you to shush. Anyway, I digress. So we've reached the triumph, and we're approaching Caesar's year as consul. So let's read what Plutarch has to say. Plutarch says, there was a law, and that law was that those who desired the honor of a triumph had to wait outside the city, while candidates for the consulship had to be present in the city in person. Caesar, who arrived at Rome just at the time of the consular elections, was therefore in a dilemma, and sent to the Senate asking permission for his name to be put forward for the consulship by his friends, while he himself remained outside the city. Cato, however, first opposed the request by insisting that it was illegal, and then, when he saw that many senators had been won over by Caesar's attentions, managed to get a vote on the matter put off by wasting time and speaking for the entire day. Caesar then decided to forego the triumph and try for the consulship. He entered the city immediately, adopted a policy which deceived everyone except Cato. This was to effect a reconciliation between Pompey and Crassus, the two most powerful people in Rome. Caesar brought these men together, making them friends instead of enemies, and used their united power for the strengthening of himself. So before anyone was aware of it, he had, by an action which could be called a simple piece of kindness, succeeded in producing what was in effect a revolution. For the cause of the civil wars was not, as most people think, the quarrel between Caesar and Pompey. It was, rather, their friendship. Since in the first place they worked together to destroy the power of the aristocracy, and only when this had been accomplished quarreled among themselves. Cato often prophesied what would happen at the time, and was considered merely bad-tempered and interfering. Afterwards, however, he was thought to have been a wise counselor, though an unsuccessful one. So what just happened here? Caesar approaches the city of Rome, and he is to celebrate his triumph. But Cato, again, the great enemy of Caesar and of all mankind, really, is a crafty, sneaky snake. And he moves the date of Caesar's triumph to coincide with the consular elections. Now remember what we just talked about. If you are a governor, if you're a proconsul, you cannot enter the city of Rome unless under a triumph. But if you want to run for consulship, you have to give up your command, which means you can't get a triumph. You have to give up your command and you have to enter as a private citizen and put your name forward as a candidate for the consulship. I am the city, Invictus says. That's right. And I want to emphasize the fact that a triumph was the greatest honor a Roman general could achieve. It was incredible to get a triumph. It was a celebration just for you. And all of Rome would know your name. And well, for Caesar, they already knew his name. But it was even greater for them. So Caesar is in a dilemma. He says, I can forego the consulship for this year and take my triumph, or I can do what no general has ever done before, and I can give up my right to a triumph, enter the city as a private citizen, and put my name on the ballot. And Caesar, he doesn't choose glory. He chooses what he knows to be right. He chooses the responsibility to the Senate and people of Rome. He gives up his right for a triumph, and he enters the city as a private citizen and puts his name on the ballot. Cato, of course, his classic tactic is to filibuster. This is all Cato knows how to do. Is when he's not getting his way, he just talks and talks and talks until no one else can speak and the day's over, and it's like, oh, whoops, I guess we can't do anything. That's Cato. But in the end, he doesn't get his way. And Cato becomes increasingly unpopular. And we'll see the folly of Cato revealed in truth when it comes time for the Civil War. But that's neither here nor there. Let's continue reading what Plutarch has to say about this event. Before we actually do that, I totally forgot to mention, we just talked about Pompey and Crassus. We have the formation of the first triumvirate. Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. Pompey and Crassus, of course, had been enemies. They disliked each other savagely. They actually had both held consulship together. And during their consulship, they couldn't get anything done. They couldn't get any of the laws or proposals they had put forward to the Senate ratified. These were senators. These were consuls. Pompey was now the most acclaimed general of his time. He essentially subdued the East. And Crassus was, for all intensive purposes, the Elon Musk of Rome. He had money for days. These were powerful men, and they couldn't get anything done. That was the state that the Senate was in. But they're able to come together via Caesar. And Caesar, along with his two new allies, makes an agreement. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. This is how it's going to be. And now, Caesar has all the cards. Let's continue on reading. Not Pompey, silly me. Plutarch. We're not reading Pompey's history, we're reading Plutarch's history. Plutarch says, so Caesar, armed and supported by the friendship of Pompey and Crassus, pressed on towards the consulship, and with Calpurnius Bibulus was triumphantly elected. As soon as he entered upon his office, he proposed various measures for the allotment and redistribution of land, measures that would have come better from some revolutionary tribune of the people than from a consul. He encountered stiff opposition from all the most respectable elements in the Senate. This was just the excuse that he had long been looking for. He vigorously protested that it was against his will, that he was being driven to put matters before the assembly of the people, but that the Senate's high-handedness and stubborn behavior left him no other course than to devote himself to the people's interest. He then hurried out of the Senate and stood up to speak before the people's assembly, with Crassus on one side and Pompey on the other. He asked them whether they had the approval of his laws, and when they said that they did. He called upon them to give him their help, and to defend him against those who were threatening to resist him with their swords. This they promised to do, and Pompey actually added that, if it was a question of swords, he could produce a sword and shield as well. The nobility were deeply offended by this mad and boyishly impulsive remark of Pompey's, so unworthy of his own dignity and so lacking of the respect properly due to the Senate. The people, however, were delighted by it. Caesar went on to gain a still firmer hold over Pompey's power and influence. He had a daughter, Julia, who was engaged to Servilius Caepo, and he now engaged her to Pompey. saying that he would arrange that Servilius could marry Pompey's daughter, though she too was engaged already, having been promised to Faustus, the son of Sulla. And shortly afterwards, Caesar married Calpurnia, a daughter of Piso, and got Piso elected as consul for the following year. At this, Cato violently protested and exclaimed that it was an intolerable state of affairs to have the government prostituted by marriage alliances and to see men pushing each other forward to high positions and the commands of provinces and armies by means of women. That's rich coming from the big olive Cato, saying that we're prostituting out the government. I won't let my feelings get a hold of me like that again. I apologize. He's just such a bastard, isn't he? As for Caesar's colleague Bibulus, so far from having any success in his efforts to obstruct Caesar's legislation, he, and Cato with him, was often in danger of being killed in the forum. So he shut himself in his house and stayed there for the rest of his term in office. And Pompey, directly after his marriage, filled the forum with armed men and helped the people to pass Caesar's law and to give him, as consular province, to be held for 5 years, Gaul on both sides of the Alps, together with Illyricum and an army of 4 legions. Cato attempted to speak against these proposals, but Caesar had him led off to prison. He imagined that Cato would appeal to the tribunes, but he walked on his way without saying a word, and when Caesar saw that not only were the nobility displeased, but the people too, out of respect for Cato's good qualities, were following him in silence and with downcast eyes, he himself privately asked one of the tribunes to get him released. Now, a lot happened there. And it's kind of hard to talk about everything in one go. We still have a good number, 20 minutes to go here, so I think we're okay. What was this legislation? He talks about it a little bit, though. The land reform. Well, Big Olive held a lot of land. They had a complete monopoly of it, and there was a push to reform this so that the government could buy up this land from the monopolies and then give it out, in a sense, to a lottery to smaller farmers, to private citizens, with the understanding that those smaller farmers who would now be tending to the land and farming it would not be able to sell that land again for something like 20 years. There were several stipulations, of course. I think one of them was that the people who were putting themselves forward to join in this policy so they could get this farmland had to have something like 3 children already. They had to be married. I think there was an exception for veterans, like Pompey's veterans, because remember, he had come back from conquering the East. But that was a huge piece of land reform that he was trying to get pushed. Now, Caesar, of course, made many compromises to get this happen. He, of course, put forward that he himself could not be serving on this commission that would help redistribute this land and try to even things out a bit. He said that the commissioners who would be appointed here would be independent. They would be voted on. He couldn't serve on it. And at the end of the day, Cato still filibustered it. Because that's all Cato could do. Ay, ay, ay. It's terrible. Let's switch over to Suetonius. And let's talk a little bit more about the consulship. This is what Suetonius has to say about the consulship. Caesar's first act as consul was to rule that a daily record of proceedings in the Senate and before the people should be taken and published. He also revived the obsolete custom of having an orderly walk before him during the months in which his colleagues held the fasces, while the lictors followed behind. Next, he introduced an agrarian law, and when Bibulus delayed its passage by announcing that the omens were unfavorable, he drove him from the forum by force of arms. On the following day, Bibulus lodged a complaint in the Senate, and when nobody dared make a vote of censure or make any observation on this scandalous event, though decrees condemning minor breaches of the peace had often been passed, he felt so frustrated that from then on he stayed at home, satisfying his resentment with further edicts about unfavorable omens. Caesar was thus enabled to govern alone and do very much as he pleased. It became a joke to sign documents in the consulship of Julius and Caesar, rather than Bibulus and Caesar, naming the same man twice with nomen and cognomen. And this lampoon went the rounds. Bibulus. What a stupid name. Bibulus. I digress. Remember how we talked about the consulship and how it was 2 men elected, not 1. You have 2 consuls per year. And the person who gets the most votes is the primary consul, I guess you could say. They hold fasces, or they're in charge first. And they take turns. They go back and forth. So there's, in this case, because Caesar got first place in January, that's his month where basically he's in charge. He does everything first. Bibulus would be February. Caesar would be March, and they would go back and forth like this. And Bibulus, after this event that we were talking about, became so unpopular that he resorted to a strategy of trying to cancel votes or interfere with Senate meetings by either calling for bad omens or declaring holidays. Now, this is where we get into the rabbit hole of Roman religion and the state, which I do not want to go down here, but suffice it to say that this was one of the most abused thing in the Roman Republic, and we should be very happy that we live mostly in states where there is a separation of the church, because good Lord, Bibulus would say the omens are bad, we can't take a vote now. The gods say it's bad. And of course, he's the consul, he's saying the omens are bad, we can't do a vote now, guys, we got to put it off. But who is Caesar? Caesar is the Pontifex Maximus. He's the Pope. Are you really going to try to tell the Pope about bad omens? The man who's literally in charge of Rome's religion? I don't know about that one. I don't know about that one, Bibulus. You know who else didn't know about that one? The rest of the Senate and the people of Rome. So embarrassed Bibulus gets from these events that he literally doesn't show up to work for the rest of the year. He has achieved the most important and powerful position in the Roman state, and he doesn't come to work. He sits at home and he tries to spell out edicts about omens. And this leaves Caesar in control every month. So instead of just 6 months, he has the full 12. And so Caesar has the reins. Let's read more about what Suetonius has to say on the consulship. Caesar partitioned 2 districts of Campania, a plain called Stellus that our ancestors had consecrated, and an agricultural district that was farmed on behalf of the Commonwealth among citizens with 3 or more children, selecting the candidates through commissioners rather than by lots. When the publicans asked for relief, he canceled 1/3 of their obligations, but gave them frank warning not to bid too high for their contracts in the future. He freely granted all other pleas whatsoever, and either met with no opposition or intimidated anyone who dared intervene. Marcus Cato once tried to delay proceedings by talking out the debate. That means filibustering. But Caesar had him forcibly ejected by a lictor and led off to prison. Lucius Lucullus went a little too far in objecting or opposing Caesar's policy, whereupon Caesar so terrified him by threats of legal proceedings that Lucullus fell on his knees and begged his pardon. Hearing that Cicero had been making a doleful speech in a court about the evils of his times, Caesar at once granted the long-standing request of Cicero's enemy, Publius Clodius, remember that guy, to be transferred from patrician to plebeian rank, rushing the measure through at the 9th hour of the very same day. Finally, he began an attack on the opposing faction by bribing Vettius to announce that some of them had tried to make him assassinate Pompey. As had been arranged, Vettius was brought before the rostra and mentioned a few names, but the whole affair was so suspicious that it led to nothing, and Caesar, realizing that he had been too hasty, is said to have poisoned his agent. This is one of those conspiracies that people talk about but never goes anywhere, and there's no proof of anything, but it's very interesting to listen to either way. What we're more concerned with here was Clodius. Publius Clodius. And what are they doing to Clodius? They're having him get demoted. They're saying, hey, you're not going to be a patrician anymore. We're going to make you a pleb. Why would he do that? Well, there's a position in the government called the tribune of the plebs. And the tribune, along with the consuls, have one very unique power in the Senate that is very easily abused. And that power is called the veto. Now, everyone knows what a veto is. In the United States, of course, the president can veto an action by the Senate. But the Roman veto was very powerful. I mean, the tribune of the plebs could basically cancel out the entire work of a Senate meeting by just vetoing anything they wanted. Someone promotes a new legislation, and they raise their hand and they say, I veto this. And this power is unchecked. You cannot have a consul veto the veto. There's not any of that back and forth. So you can see that having allies, these tribunes of the plebs, which of course have to come from someone who's a plebeian rank, can be very useful. And that will come into play later while Caesar is in Gaul, but we're not going to be worried too much about that. We'll finish off by reading something from Suetonius here. Suetonius says, having thus secured the goodwill of his father-in-law and of his father-in-law Piso and his son-in-law Pompey, Caesar surveyed the many provinces open to him and chose Gaul to be the likeliest to supply him with wealth and triumphs. True, he was at first appointed governor only of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum. The proposal came from Vatinius, but afterwards the Senate added Transalpine Gaul to his jurisdiction, fearing that if this were denied him, the people would insist that he should have it. His elation was such that he could not refrain from boasting to a packed Senate house some days later that having now gained his dearest wish, to the annoyance and grief of his opponents, he would proceed to stamp upon their persons. When someone interjected with a sneer that a woman would not find this an easy feat, he answered amicably, why not? Semiramis was supreme in Syria, and the Amazons once ruled over a large part of Asia. That's confusing, and we don't really care about most of that, because this is more kind of Suetonius stuff. But the point is, he has 2 provinces assigned to him for his proconsulship. And that is Cisalpine Gaul, so that's like northern Italy, and Illyricum, which is in the east. It's across the sea from Italy to the east. However, while this is going on, the governor, the proconsul of Transalpine Gaul, passes away. He dies. And it's without a governor. And so the Senate votes that Caesar take Transalpine Gaul as well. Now, to my knowledge, there has never before been a proconsul who had governed 3 provinces at the same time. And if that wasn't surprising enough, they gave him his command for 5 years. So for 5 years, he would have his provinces and he would be governor. Now, from the Senate's perspective, I can understand this. This seems like it's incredibly generous to Caesar, and it is. But it also means he's not in Rome. And he's not at the Senate meetings, and he's not doing legislation, he's not standing up in the Senate as a former consul and doing business there. He is, at least temporarily, out of the picture. And I think Big Olive, as it were, the senators, were at this point so afraid of Caesar and what he could do, and how he was changing the Republic, and how their own power was waning, that they said, just get him out of here. Just let him go. He wants the 3rd province, to hell with it. Just give it to him. Again, like Plutarch says, these came with 4 legions. So he will have an army. And there's something else happening in Gaul. We're going to read this next time, next week's episode, but I'll give you a hint. During Caesar's consulship, perhaps slightly before, he learned of a potential migration of a tribe called the Helvetii. He also learned of a great migration of Germans across the Rhine, led by a king called Ariovistus. And perhaps to stave off this Germanic menace, he had Ariovistus named as a friend of the Roman people. But now we can see that Gaul is a powder keg. The Gauls are on the move. The Germans they have turned to are treacherous and seek to betray them and to attack the civilized world itself. And it is in this state that we enter the opening act of the Gallic War. Next time, on next week's episode of Reconquering History, we will enter the first days, weeks, and months of Caesar's time in Gaul. We will get to know Caesar's allies, the Aedui, Diviciacus. We will know Caesar's enemies, Dumnorix, the migrating Helvetii, the German king Ariovistus, the treacherous Belgae, the Nervi. And we will understand that what Caesar accomplished in Gaul was both just, right, and for the benefit of all mankind. Thank you everyone for joining me today. If you're watching this on YouTube, again, make sure to like and subscribe. You can come join us live on Twitch at twitch.tv/authorvalentine. If you're watching this on Twitch, thank you all for joining me today. I do appreciate it. We'll be continuing this next week. And until then, I do wish you the best of days, nights, and mornings, wherever you may be in the world. Until then, thank you all again, and I'll see you next time.